Hi everyone, welcome one and all to my workshop. My name is Kara, and today I'll be painting a 60mm elf bust from Dragon Dice Games. Dragon Dice Games is a growing independent business located in the UK. Their shipping is fast and free across the whole country, and they also ship to the United States. You should really go check them out. Their quality is amazing, and they are run by just the most wonderful people. I highly recommend them. My model arrived fast and in perfect condition, with very few support marks from printing. The finish was smooth, and it only took about 5 minutes with a fine sanding stick and a craft knife to scrape off the very few print markings that were on there. This is just by far the best quality of any print I've ever seen during my time in the hobby. And so, using a large soft makeup brush, I wiped off any resin that's left on the model from sanding now. I used some double-sided adhesive tape and a large cork to hold the sculpt still while priming to avoid any fingerprints while my undercoat was drying. Using Chaos Black and Mechanicus standard grade primers, I gave my mini a basic zenithal prime as a guide for my highlights and shadows later on in painting. Being the absolute dumbass that I am, I dropped my model while I was off camera, and I only noticed this missing ear later on. Considering that I dropped it from chest height though, I was very surprised that that was the only damaged part of the miniature. So, using a sanding stick, a craft knife, some super glue, and a little bit of Tamiya cement, I reattached the ear and did my best to make it look like it was kind of like a flesh wound on the ear. Sometimes in this hobby we screw up, and in situations like mine you just have to try your best to make something work. And in this case, it's a broken part of a mini. I used varying ratios of Abaddon Black and Administratum Grey to fill in any patches and mistakes from priming, parts where the spray paint didn't quite reach because I did it in kind of a rush. I also used this colour to bring the broken ear that wasn't primed to a similar grey tone, just so it would work well with the paint going over it, so it matches the rest of the model. As far as I know, elves have quite bright skin tones, and so I started off with a mix of Bugman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone as my first base coat for the skin, painting lightly with thin layers to keep her skin looking smooth and youthful. I used a larger amount of Cadian Flesh Tone to add some subtle lighting to the face and neck, and that set a good guideline for later highlights when I come back to the skin tones. Using Evil Sun's Scarlet and my previous grey mix, I kind of just ever so slightly mixed some red and darker colours into my base tones for the lips and the recesses around the eyes, cheeks and neck, going back and forth to keep the colours subtle and blended in. So, moving on to the cloak, I decided to start by laying down a thin base coat of Caliban green. In most medias, elves tend to wear kind of green clothing, and while I do like to do things a little differently, I wanted to avoid being ambitious with this project, as it's my first bust model. I wanted to keep things plain and simple. Using Incubi Darkness as my darkest green tone, I started to block in parts of shade, making use of the shadows from the zenithal undercoat as a reference for where to place my darkest green. It was super helpful, and I'm definitely going to make use of that in future projects. I went back and forth between my green tones, trying to smooth the blend between the two greens, just to make it smooth enough to create that kind of soft lighting effect. After adding Avalon Sunset to my palette to brighten my green, I started placing highlights on the cloak in thin and patchy coats. This helped achieve an uneven lighting effect to kind of match with the material I'm painting. I decided to experiment a little and used a very old Citadel paint called Putrid Green to just slightly add vibrancy and colour variation. This paint is older than me, I'm very surprised it still works. It was only around this time when I noticed that I'd not finished painting the chest and shoulder, so I had to go back quickly with my skin colours and fix up wherever I hadn't painted. Using Caltham Brown as a base coat, I started to coat the quiver, but decided to throw in some Rhinox hide into the mix in order to darken down the colour and get varying blends across the surface. I moved a lot between the two colours until I was happy with the result. This went on for quite some time. I added a little Baneblade Brown into my mix with my leather colours in an attempt to kind of get a brighter wood tone for the arrows. This didn't exactly work too well, but I figured I'd stick with it because it still worked well enough. I went back and added lighter and darker tones across the quiver to give it more depth and texture. After adding Orthuan Grey onto my palette and mixing it with a touch of brown, I used that as my base coat for the feathers on the arrows because I needed a darker and kind of dirtier undertone in preparation for the white highlights. Mixing more Orthuan Grey onto the palette and switching down to a smaller brush, I started to add a lighter coat onto the feathers for more definition and vibrancy. Then I neatened up the wood on the arrows again with the same colour that I was using before. Moving on with Skull White, I added a small highlight streaks to the feathers to emphasise the texture. Moving ahead onto the tunic, I decided to paint that before going on with the hair. I wanted to get a good idea of what would work well with my colour choices before moving on to probably one of the main outstanding parts of the bust. I chose to use a mix of Warflesh and Deathguard Green and a touch of brown from my palette as a base colour. Then, using just Deathguard Green, I added some subtle highlights as a better blend into my main lighting. Adding small amounts of Nurgling Green and Ogrin Camo into my mix, and using a smaller brush again, I slowly built up the layers for the brighter parts of my highlights. I left the sides and top parts unpainted because I wasn't quite sure if those were meant to be the same colour as the rest. With most surfaces covered on the model, I started moving on to the hair. I chose to go for a yellow blonde as I felt it would sit well with my current colour choices. I mixed up some Avalon Sunset, Rhinox Hide and Xandri Dust and started to lay down my initial base coat, being careful not to make mistakes near the edges. I accidentally thinned down my mix a bit too much and I had to thicken it out again as I went along. After adding Ushabti Bone into the mix, I once again switched down to a smaller brush and tried to start highlighting the hair. Adding more Ushabti Bone and a little Skull White that was already on my palette in order to brighten my highlights a bit more, I wanted to experiment a little and switched over to a soft dry brush for the brighter highlights. Once that was done, I took a little time to clean up any mistakes with my previous colours, just going over and filling in any gaps or stray paint. Moving back to the tunic and other parts of the model, I decided that the unpainted parts of it needed to be the same colour as the rest, so I went back with the same combination of colours and painted it just as before. Using Caltham Brown, I painted the small leather straps on the tunic, and then outlined them with Rhinox Hide. Afterwards, I used a small amount of Reichland Flesh Shade to shade certain recesses and add a little extra depth, and separate parts of the model just ever so slightly. The mistake I made earlier was that I didn't paint the leather straps at the same time as I painted the quiver. I used whatever browns were still alive on my wet palette and tried to match the colour again. Going back onto the hair, I felt like my highlights were just a little too bright and chalky, and the recesses weren't quite painted well enough. I went back with a very thinned down copy of my base tone and washed over the hair to dull the highlights and fill in any gaps that weren't quite the same colour as the rest. Moving on to the golden buckle, I decided not to bother trying non-metallic metals. I originally planned to do that, but decided against it because I didn't feel confident enough and I was already spending too much time on this project as I was. I used Retributor armor for the base coat, and then mixed in a little Screaming Skull to brighten the tone slightly for a brighter highlight with the gold. Moving on to the eyes, I used a combination of Ulthuan Grey and Abaddon Black and set down a base tone. Using a mid-tone grey to help me build up to a bright white for the eyes was incredibly helpful because I didn't have to spend hours layering the same bright paint over and over again. I used pure Abaddon Black to paint the eyelashes and add depth around the whites of the eyes, and then I went back with the skin colours and the eye whites and cleaned up any mistakes. Using Screamer Pink, I carefully painted the iris of the eyes with a small detail brush. I made sure to keep it thin enough that I could easily cover it over or wipe it away if I messed up. I had to do this in multiple layers to build up the full opacity of the iris, and I used a slightly brighter shade to map around where the pupils are. Moving back to Abaddon Black, I painted the pupils of the eyes. I had to take extra care with this step so I wouldn't ruin the irises or get any paint anywhere else. I went back with my iris colour to just tidy up any slight parts of black that had maybe just overrun where I wanted it to go. And anyone who knows me will know that with most of my art, I tend to add specific light reflections in the eyes, so I decided to try using that style for this project, and I'm quite happy with how it turned out. Then I moved back onto the skin. I wanted to push the pale tone a little more and add brighter highlights. This time I added lots of Cadian flesh tone into the mix, barely using any of my darker tones. I started to paint all the highlighted areas with my brighter tones, adding Kislev flesh and Flayed One flesh into the mix as I went along. I added a little more depth to the colour on the lips, making sure they stood out and had a natural colour to them. I also used some of this colour on the broken parts of the left ear just to make it seem scarred. This didn't work out very well, but with a little cleaning up, it looked better than it did originally, and I feel I made do with what I had. The whole second stage of doing these skin tones took me about another hour to do. I was making sure my blends were smooth and my colours looked right, and I kinda had that depth in the face. I'm very happy with the result. I feel like I could have pushed the highlights and tones a little brighter, but in terms of how neat and clean it is to me, I'm very happy with it. Onto the finishing touches, I finally used Vallejo matte varnish on the cloak and tunic just to kind of dull down the brighter shine from the satin paints. I also painted the base of the bust with Incubi Darkness, but I did that off camera because I'm dumb and I forget to record things. So that's it, it's done. The whole project took me about 12, maybe 13 or 14 hours to film, and it took me over a week to edit it because I'm lazy as shit. Please consider subscribing and liking the video because I need that sweet dopamine to course through my soft body. Thanks for watching the video, I hope you enjoyed. It would mean a lot to me if you could leave a comment or some feedback on my project and my content, as I'm just starting out. Please remember to always be kind and considerate to your fellow hobbyists, and always treat each other with respect and help each other. Until next time, my friends, see ya. I added a little Beyblade. Fuck's sake. Fucking Beyblade. Oh my god. Oh.